So, oh, yay.
Okay, hi everyone. So sorry we were having Zoom issues, but we've got it all figured out with some host sharing. And this is life these days. So
Really?
we're really glad to have you. We're celebrating Yanyi's new book, Dream of the Divided Field, and we'll just wait just a minute to get started as people filter into the Zoom. Yay. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's so wonderful to see you, to see your names. All right. Do you still want to play your intro music?
Gosh, hold on.
Yanyi has some very special walk-on music.
I love walk-on music. If you've been to any event that I've ever done.
Butterfly in the sky, I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. I can go anywhere.
All right, so we'll just get started in just a moment after this beautiful intermission.
A reading rainbow. A reading rainbow.
All right.
Music for you.
Okay. So someone asked about captioning, so I'm just looking into setting that up. Thank you for asking. I will look into this after I give my intro, just so that we can get the ball rolling here and I can work on that behind the scenes. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and thank you for bearing with us as we figure out some technicals. And welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jean from Greenlight, and we're so thrilled to host tonight's event with Yanyi presenting his new book, Dream of the Divided Field. He will be talking with Sandra Lim, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Yanyi, Sandra, and the team at One World for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're really grateful for your support. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can hear and see us, but we can't see or hear you. We can see that you're here though, and there are a couple of different ways you can interact. One is the chat, which a lot of you are already using. We really encourage you to use that to show your love for the authors, to interact with us, and to respond, to even echo things that you find moving. It's a really great way to show your appreciation. And if you have a question for Yanyi and or Sandra, you can put that in the Q&A module, which looks like two speech balloons, that icon. And most importantly, tonight's featured book, Dream of the Divided Field, is for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. It's beautiful, it's orange. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave store in Brooklyn, or you can order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. And as thanks for attending tonight, we're offering 10% off the price if you enter the code Greenlight Events 10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online. You can get that discount. And without further ado, our speakers tonight, our interviewer tonight is Sandra Lim. Sandra is the author of 3 collections of poetry, most recently The Curious Thing, The Wilderness, and Loveliest Grotesque. She has received the Barnard Women's Poets Prize, the Levis Reading Prize, an American Academy of Arts and Letters Literature Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She is an associate professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, and also serves on the poetry faculty in the Warren Wilson College MFA program for writers. Born in Seoul, Korea, she lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She will be speaking with our featured author, Yanyi. Yanyi is a writer and a critic. He is the author of The Year of Blue Water, which won the 2018 Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize. His work has been featured in NPR's All Things Considered, Tin House, Granta, A Public Space, and at the New York Public Library, and he's received fellowships from Asian American Writers Workshop and Poets House. He's currently poetry editor at Foundry and giving creative advice at The Reading, which is an excellent newsletter and community. Yanyi's new book, Dream of the Divided Field, was praised by Ilya Kaminsky as a book like no other, tender and eloquent, a singing across borders, across silences. And now, without further ado, Yanyi is going to start us off with a reading, and then he'll be talking with Sandra and with all of you. Thank you so much. Please take it away, you two.
Thank you so much, Jean, for having both of us, for having me, and for having this book that you can get for 10% off. I'm really, really happy to be sharing this work with you, and I guess I'll just start, and we'll go on into the conversation. In the museum, the monument lives inside the body. The monument lives outside. Two bodies may be monuments side by side, enacting what is already a memory. Move through the halls, you are styled with wings, and pass on constantly while you are living. There are no walls between the living and the dead, only what you remember now and what you remember ahead. Obad, the lake. Buried dawn broke onto slight leaves, and geese between a cold and hot sky, a mountain and a sunrise. It is 5 months since we separated. I am not so different from the long hair stretched by her shadow, her spirit hanging. What I would give for the dead beat of mud shaped and now eaten in, coyotes rousing in fast laps of the moon. Take me to the lake and do no evil. Lead me by the hair to who I love. Coming over. What was left of our relationship neatly folded on the couch, and the bathroom noticed what else was missing. You came into the bathroom, taking out your razor, your toothbrush, leaving my toothbrush, replacing everything next to its double, as though I had needlessly doubled. I walked out from my bathroom and you walked into my bathroom. The little soap and the razor, the duplicates in the bags not wanting to owe me anything, not wanting to have appeared. It is like that. I give my house and you take how you live in it, not backwards or forwards, but the past and the present overcoming one another. I'll read one more, if I can find it. Where is it? Where did I put it? At the end of somewhere at the end of my book. Here it is. Obad, I woke up with so much love for you. It doesn't matter where I am. I am making eggs. The sun is warming my just shaved head, like your hand when sometimes it rests there. Thank you so much. I'm hearing your claps, even though I can't hear them. Okay. Hello.
Hello. Oh, that was just tantalizingly too short, but maybe
5-minute reading.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more. I'm just going to hold up the book again, a very lovely cover. I'm so glad to be able to see you and talk about this beautiful book with you. Congratulations. But I have a really important question before we even get into the collection. We were talking about this a little bit off camera, but what is your sun sign and rising sign? And maybe you are the kind of person who also knows your moon sign.
This is such an important question. Thank you so much for asking it. I'm an Aries sun, Virgo rising, Capricorn moon.
Oh my gosh, you do know your moon. Okay.
Yeah, I'm one of those astrology people.
Okay. I am sort of, but selfishly, I only know my own signs. Like I'm a Taurus sun, Libra rising, Taurus
Wow.
moon, I think. Yes. So
Oh my gosh, that makes so much sense for your work.
well, this is why this is relevant. This is relevant. All signs. So we'll
It
keep that in
is.
the background. But getting down to this book, so your first book, The Year of Blue Water, came out in 2018. And often it's the case that the second book can be really kind of a daunting prospect for any writer. How did this book, Dream of the Divided Field, kind of start for you? Did you have a certain thing in mind or questions and preoccupations that you weren't quite finished with yet in the first book? How did this collection kind of spring to life for you?
It's a great question. I think that like I mean it's a really good question because I feel like the first book is often like your first breath or the first way that you introduce yourself in a way to the larger reading community, however one imagines that or hallucinates that.
Yeah.
So I mean, so there's this thing called the Year Younger curse or the Yale Younger curse, which is that the idea basically, if you're a Yale Younger poet, you will never come out with another collection after you're Yale Younger. So I was thinking about that or fearing that, which is another thing that I think was on me when I was working on this book. But I really tried planning my next book, which is, as I learned, incorrect because you can't. I knew that I wanted to write something that was kind of stylistically different from my first book because in a way I had a poetic voice that I think is much more obvious or pronounced in this book, that the prose style of the first book kind of was a way of writing actually that enabled me to write. And that was, I wouldn't say separate from my poetic voice necessarily, but really only one facet of it. And I really enjoyed actually working through different forms and kind of using the line again in this particular book. But I would be curious, Sandra, if you have this experience between your first two books. But I kind of I had to have a period of just taking a breather, and I had to learn that I was capable of writing another book. There's this kind of fear that like, once you write the first book, that's the last thing because you haven't done it twice, so you just don't know. And I ended up writing this because I had to, that there was something emotionally that I had to work through that wasn't kind of the mental health crisis that I had for my first book. It was something like it was a relationship. It was kind of moving through different transitions in my life. And so the book kind of emerged in the ways that I think books now I know generally tend to do.
That's great. No, and I asked this question partly because I think similarly to you, I think planning a book, I tried planning my second book as well, didn't work out so good for me. It just had to throw it away or put it in a drawer and really start fresh. So I think, but then with the third book, and I'm sure it will be the case, you just have to start from scratch again in, on some sense. So it's very difficult, but you obviously ended up with something. I love how different it sounds, this book from your first book, because it's just, I think that's part of the difficulty, the reinvention each time. And one of the things that I particularly love about this book is it's kind of like openly lyric tenor. So there are several poems, and you read two of them in the museum, one of the obads. So like a lot of the poems you're working through, maybe the collapse of a relationship, or you're kind of working out more like trickier metaphysical questions, but often they conclude in this like rhymed or slant rhymed couplet. But I love that because I feel like in those poems, if I'm reading them correctly, you're sort of resolving lyrically what can't quite be settled or solved, rationally or logically, etc. In that vein, when you're writing, or maybe when you were writing these particular poems, do you have a kind of lyric eye or interiority that you conceive of? Like, who are you talking to, or what kind of space? What does that look like?
Great question. And also really good observation about the rhyming thing that I do. I'm working on new poems right now, and I keep doing this rhyming thing. I've been noticing it recently. I think you're right that, so I guess I've been calling myself this in interviews, and I think I'm just gonna keep doing it. I'm an ear poet. And for me, a lot of the times when I know I'm going to write something new, it's because I'm chasing after a sound or a rhythm that has appeared. Sometimes it's like I read something on the page and I'm like, that sets off something for me. Like I'll be reading anything, doesn't matter. Sometimes it's my own journal entries, sometimes it's like a newspaper article or something. But it is often for me a kind of like it's really hard to explain. It's like I'm tuning into something cosmic or something spiritual that is an interior voice for me, but it's a voice that comes from outside of me, or feels like when I go deeper into myself, I'm going outside of myself. Very Buddhist thing to say. There's that, Virginia Woolf has this thing where she says in her journals, I cease to be Virginia, I become a sensibility, when she writes. And that's really kind of how I feel, as it is almost as though I'm creating something for the self that I return to read and understand and learn something new. But when I'm in the space of writing, it's as though I'm trying to gaze into a horizon that is a plane beyond perception, of like concrete perception. So yeah, I mean, it often starts with music and has to do with music, because I think that is kind of the sound of my intuition, that comes from the built sensibility of all of the poems and all of the language I've ever read.
That's so great. That's such a great quote by Virginia Woolf. And I love that idea of sensibility, because often if I like a collection of poems or a novel or whatever, a magazine article, it's often the sensibility that I'm attracted to. Or so if you're hitting that right sensibility, I'll listen to whatever you have to say. But that idea, I think, as you said, when you're writing, you can't quite grasp like what's kind of right on the horizon. You're approaching that, and that's part of maybe the process of the poem. That's very felt, I think, in this collection. There are many obads in this work. Who are some of, it got me thinking, who were the love poets that Yanyi was reading or really loves? I mean, it's such a particular form, right? The song or the poem, it's the song of goodbye at dawn, right? You're trying to deny that it's dawn, so the night doesn't have to end, or the time with the lover doesn't have to end, but it is like this elegy, or it's a goodbye. I was wondering who were some of your influences, or who you like, love poets, love poems.
Another great question. So I was rereading a lot of Linda Gregg and Jack Gilbert when I was in the process of, I guess, coming to this book. I had written a lot of the, many of the poems in this book came from a journal that I wrote into after the end of this relationship. That it's a journal where you're like, I'm writing it and it's just going to go away. And I really wasn't intending on rereading it, but I was I really distinctly remember deciding to read all of Linda Gregg's work from the start to the end, her discography, if you will.
Oh, wow.
And I just remember reading Too Bright to See and Alma. And I don't remember, I think it's in Too Bright to See. There's this poem at the end of Too Bright to See. I think it is Too Bright to See, where she writes about being in a garden at twilight and trying to garden and crying in the garden. And there's this beautiful image of her, of her pleading, someone please come get me or come see me, mouth open, like eyes open. I would go get the poem right now if I could. But I think for me, I've always been really struck by her work in particular, that her use of the fragment, which I was talking to a friend earlier today, where reading a Linda Gregg poem kind of feels like a door off of a hinge, but connected to a bunch of other doors with that slightly off hinge, where there's space and there's this feeling of something opening, but you can't quite see exactly what it is. You have to glance at it in a sidelong way and guess what it is. So that actually, her sensibility was something that was really influential for me when I was working on this book, because especially the first couple of her books, which are about kind of the dissolution of her relationship with Gilbert, and then I think also some other people. And I also really love Frank O'Hara. So Frank O'Hara was like one of my original faves, I guess, which is kind of where the voice of, I would say, it's very much the style of ambulance that comes later in the book. That was a song that I heard, but obviously it was, for a while I wrote in this kind of exuberant style that was kind of O'Hara-esque. And I stopped doing that for many reasons, because I was moving into different forms of myself. But Frank O'Hara is another one. I think I'll just leave it at that. I love poetry.
Me too. It's like, why not? I was just looking up ambulance, and also just as you listed or mentioned Linda Gregg and Jack Gilbert, there's a poem in here, right, that references I want to say the place or the village.
That's Paradise Lost. I don't remember which page that's on.
Oh, I found it. Page.
Oh, you're so good.
50. Would you mind reading? I'm going to dot a little bit of this Q&A so we can hear just a little.
Oh, yeah. Okay. As I burp. Okay. Paradise Lost. Standing where the village just awakened, just the shops and couples taking pictures in the most beautiful place on earth, the bougainvillea flaring deeply. Not yet, still darker, all very sudden wanting to speak again. Wet air cleft by heat and cold collected bare on liters of water. Been waiting for the bus to Akrotiri, but following a woman calling monolithos. Monolithos, for black sand and charred fish with a thirst of no brilliance. Monolithos, the sound of her voice. I want to be beautiful and a part of this earth.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thank you.
And there's, just before we leave this poem or love poetry, I mean, we never have to really leave love poetry, but just the shape of it is really interesting. I was struck by this too, because I wondered for, a lot of the poems, I guess most of the poems, I mean, there's some prose poems, but it's in free verse. When you sit down to write, do you often have a form in my, or in this case, because it's so structured, does it often, I mean, I'm sometimes assuming it all happens at the same time, but in, say, a poem like that, was there a moment you remember, a decision being made where, oh, I need to have these sort of images or moments on the left-hand side and this kind of spacing?
Mm-hmm. This poem is really, formally speaking, kind of spontaneous. Like it, as you were saying earlier, as you said, mentioned in your question, it was kind of like in the writing of it. So I was reading Jory Graham's Region of Unlikeness when around the time when I was writing this poem, and I was really interested in the way that she lineates in that book, where she had, it was almost as though it's like, it kind of looks like this. You know what I mean? Where like there's more on one side and more on another side, but it's never kind of like centered, and it doesn't create kind of that column.
Right.
But she does that like every other line, basically. And I was interested in kind of playing with that and seeing where that might lead me. But this poem, I think, took a couple of different forms before it landed here. I was really interested in creating more space in the poem, like silence, contemplation, and I felt as though kind of moving the certain stanzas on the smaller stanzas on one side and the longer stanzas on another would be a way to do that. I was also kind of interested, as I put it down visually on the page, on and how like the different kinds of images, what images ended up like on this side versus that side. There's kind of a thinking self more on one side and more observation on another. That kind of felt like, for me, like about formally kind of speaking to the way that it felt to be in Greece, in Santorini. At that time it was August, and being so hot that I couldn't read or write, and being kind of dislodged by language and having to kind of be present in wherever it is that I was. So yeah, that's kind of why this poem is the way that it is. Yeah, and I was also like, something that was really, I was on Santorini, so there are always couples at like 6 a.m. taking engagement photos. And that's where the first stanza comes from, because this was a period of silence in that relationship, that when we weren't talking. And yeah, there's always a story for the papers to be sold one day.
Right. No, but it's quite helpful. Even when you made that gesture, when you said you're talking about the gram and things being kind of almost pulled apart. Because, I mean, again, one of the things I love about love poems, and in your love poems, this one's quieter, but there's a kind of, I almost, now that you say you were on Santorini, that oppressive heat, and those like white cubes in the sun, and then the kind of Disneyland, like, this is what love or marriage or couples, things look like, or romance looks like. But I love the just sort of immense creativity that you can have in a love poem, but also the kind of dangerous, there's a kind of static sense that can happen. And here I felt more as if there's a kind of worry about the stasis too. And maybe something, I felt that intuitively in the form. So that was really interesting that, and now I have like the kind of backdrop, the heat of Greece to add into that. So very interesting. But, one of the things I wanted to ask you, I mean, I think I get asked this all the time too, but, a lot of the influences you mentioned, Linda Gregg, Jory Graham, Jack Gilbert, Virginia Woolf. I mean, as very canonical writers, as an Asian American writer and a writer with like several different affiliations, when you think about sort of the lyric possibilities of the personal, do you ever feel self-conscious or defensive or maybe even protective of the kind of lyric individuality when you're writing. Often I feel like still any ethnic American writer or writer with certain pronounced affiliations, I'll say, are still read autobiographically often. There's more about reception, I suppose, but do any of these things factor in? Well, both when you sit down to write, but I'm sure post-writing, when you're giving a reading or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, we could have an entire conversation about this because the first thing that I feel is protective, and not necessarily of myself. I feel protective of kind of, especially if I'm writing about my family. There's a whole section in this book that's kind of what I consider family poems. And I was trying to play with that a little bit. I'm very interested in lying, in the kind of like, what kind of like, why would deceiving or saying like lying or deceit, like in a poem like Family Tree, which is after that Luc Sant poem that called Resume, in which he writes a paragraph that is like his autobiography, and then the next paragraph it starts over again, but something is slightly changed. And I was really interested in that. I was interested in kind of like, well, if you're gonna, I think part of writing as someone, as you're saying, with a pronounced identity, or just like someone who's visible in a way who's not necessarily just extra visible. There's, I think, for me, a strong awareness of that in the way that I feel like I watch how other writers are tokenized and or marginalized for their concerns. And I have to ask myself, well, am I afraid of writing this particular thing because I don't want to be marginalized for talking about this particular thing? Or am I afraid, or do I not want to write this because I don't want to be token? It's like, you can't really win. It's rock or hard place. So for me, I've kind of landed in this place of I should be mindful and thoughtful about the ways that I present myself in public, but but racism kind of has nothing to do with me, and the ways that other people read me also has nothing to do with me. That the most important thing when I'm writing is my private experience of my own writing, and if I can't get life out of the thing that I hope will help others grow life from, or get some sort of life from, then I have a problem. And then I think about, kind of the downstream things of like, is this voyeuristic? What are the kind of ethical questions around me writing this particular thing? I struggled with that a lot just in writing poems like The Friend. And I think those are like ongoing questions. I may change my mind. I may make decisions that are different from the things that I did in this book with the next book.
Of course. No, I think it's so often that, I mean, one is never writing in a vacuum, but I often think about it as like, if I write in one way, if I decide to take on a certain topic, this is going to make me legible or non-legible in a certain manner. I mean, that's as far as I think of it. You can feel too hamstrung, I think, if you're thinking about this each time. And I trust that interior self and that intuitive poetic self the most. So that makes sense to me. But I think it's funny because it's even in the question. I mean, I was like, but I did want to ask you this question because it's an interesting and important topic, but I'm glad I asked you first about your horoscope. That is the most important affiliation, like
it's true.
Would you mind reading Family Tree?
Yeah. I also wanted to, I thought of another thing too, just now, kind of attached to what we were talking about, which is that, like, how earlier you were like, there's something really amazing about love poems because they're dangerous, because you can fall into a kind of stasis.
Hmm.
I was like thinking about that in terms of cliche, like the way that I feel about cliche of like writing something that feels kind of tired is like kind of the way that I also feel about like encroaching upon a topic that is not necessarily fresh for the Asian American perspective.
Right.
Um, there's
Right.
like, yeah, something about that. I think that's kind of similar that we can talk about.
Yeah, yeah.
Family tree. I was born on October 1st, 1980, in Guangzhou, China. My mother walked herself to the hospital. She said she found me in a basket. I was born on October 2nd, 1990, in Nanjing, China. My father was not there for my birth. My father waited for me to be born but left when I didn't come out. My mother has a long scar from where I, or they, cut her. I was born a girl and I was born a boy. I was born on October 3rd in the 70s, in the fourth largest city of my parents' province. My father stayed for my birth, but I didn't show up. When I did, my mother still has a scar. I left on a plane when I was 4.5, saw my father for the first time when we landed. When I grew up, I forgot his birthday. He told me he made up the date of his birthday, so I don't know whether I forgot the lie or the real thing. I was born as my father, who died in the womb. I was born on October 4th, 1990, in Shanghai, China, the only child of my parents. My parents met in silence. I imagine them laughing. Rarely did they laugh together in memory, but this doesn't mean it didn't happen. I was born on October 5th in the 80s, in the second largest city of my parents' province. My mother was 27, only a month apart from my father. Later, we moved to Canada. My mother worked in the back of a Chili's to learn English. My father learned English by eating the nightly mozzarella sticks. We cooked cats with neighbors and friends. I kept jars and jars of grasshoppers. My parents grew more than a month apart. My father named me for a bird, then disappeared into migration.
Thank you. I love how it almost keeps obsessively reworking that and showing that or doing that in front of the reader. But this idea of taking on topics that may or may not be so fresh, for some audiences, that may be what's desired because it's immediately legible. Someone wants to know what somebody has to say about that. I like how this kind of plays with all those things that we've been talking about in some sense. But it moves forward. And again, I think there's that kind of lyric resolution. My father named me for a bird, then disappeared into migration. It doesn't feel like doomed to me in that image. So lovely, thank you. How did you know when you were finished with this book? Because I'm just very aware, having put together a book recently. I'm like, oh, because you look at it as a practitioner, you're like, there are 5 parts. How did he decide this, that? And then I paid very much close attention to, it opens with this, it ends with this, the first word is this, the last word is this. How did you know when you were finished? I mean, relatedly, people always ask me, how do you know when a poem of yours is finished? So either one of those questions or both.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear about your process too, for the curious thing, because there's it was very interesting for me to go from my first book to this book, because my first book was in many ways a lot easier to order. Mm-hmm. Because when you write a book that is not only different in the content, etc. I mean, like my first book was prose poems, and so the style and the tone was very much the same, and it was very different with this book. There were poems that had certain kind of predilections and certain things that they wanted to say, and I think, as you know, when you put one poem next to another poem, there's always resonances. Mm-hmm. And you have to think about the space from one poem that's saying one thing and another poem that's saying kind of the same thing, but like it needs to be far away enough for, again, for it to not be like you're hitting them over the head with a hammer.
Right.
And I think what I had to do was honestly, like I had to rework the order again and again. There were some poems that, like for example, Reconstruction was the first poem in this book for a very long time, or not Reconstruction, I'm sorry, Deconstruction. That's the poem that starts, if it was you I loved, then I only imagined a dream with no borders, or yeah, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So that was at the beginning of, and there, like Landscape with 100 Turns was always at the end. And one of the things that I really had to do was break up my idea of like what's supposed to be the beginning and what's supposed to be the end. I do a lot of like looking at poems that are grouped together. Mm-hmm. So whether or not they're twins, I noticed that I had a lot of twins in this book. Poems that seem to be really speaking to each other, having resonances or whatever. And then thematically, there's a couple of different transitions in the book. The transition from heartbreak through grief and to something else, a body, transition of immigration and how that immigration moves through generations. So there were a lot of kind of like things I was trying to braid and weave together. And so it was really hard. And I, if you had spoken to me in August of 2019 and showed me the manuscript that I had then versus the manuscript that I would have had in, I guess, January of 2021, it was like almost a completely different manuscript. The original poem, Dream of the Divided Field, that was originally in this book, I completely scrapped and I wrote a new title poem for the book because I realized that it was not the right poem because it was too lyric. It was too disappearing into migration.
Interesting. Oh my God. So this is why it's so fascinating to think about process. But it's so interesting. You said the word twins, and I know you're saying that in terms of poems talking to each other, but what I love about this book is you get such an enlarged sense of the self, the body, the lyric eye, from all the, I mean, and you said you liked Linda Gregg for her kind of the way she works with fragments, but you know, it could have been a kind of collection where at the end, I'm like, oh, I feel kind of fragmented and sort of just, you know, multiple selves, multiplicity. We can celebrate that. But I felt more sort of there was a kind of cohesion as well, not in a simplistic way, like now the speaker in this poem is walking off into some kind of sunset, but expansive. Maybe that's the best way to put it. Oh my gosh, I just realized I'm just going to check the Q&A because I am very aware it's already 8:20 and it's so fun to talk to you, but I also wanted to give the audience a chance to ask their questions. Here is one. Okay.
Nice.
Thank you. All right. Oh, this is one of my favorite poems. So Caitlin Chan asks, in lengthening rites, there's a luxuriating in your senses and aliveness and corporeality. And you write that quote, in the mornings, rather, the poems were there. They didn't need to be written, unquote. Could you share more about how you translate the granular texture of your days into poems? I love this poem too. I was going to have you read it, but there's the question. So how do you translate the granular texture of your days into poems?
Well, thank you, Caitlin, for the question. It's interesting because I was thinking about the end of that poem, and it really, I mean, the argument is very much that the poem, like poetry to me is like from this place of consciousness of existence that we cannot touch and yet yearn to touch, and or yearn to be a part of, yearn to bring back into our conscious world, wherever the perceptible world. And I feel like even with like prose poems like that, to bring in the granularity of the day is to just be present in it, and also to be able to see the fragments of the details that are in front of you, and be able to see that they are part of each other in some way. So yeah, I mean, that's what I generally do. I write, if sometimes I'll see something or think about something and it'll turn into a larger poem. I've been doing this morning practice recently where I wake up, I've been waking up at around 5, more like 5:30. And I sit in front of my sun lamp in the dark and I journal and respond to a prompt, which hilariously, I used to be really against prompts. I thought they were stupid and terrible. And I think that's the Aries part of me, actually, of like, no, you can't tell me what to do. But it's actually been really lovely because I've been, by kind of like willingly following someone else's prompt, I've been able to kind of open myself up to new ways of perceiving or new ideas of how to perceive. And I think that's actually has been really important for my transformation into whatever the next voice I have will be. I've been writing these very, I wouldn't say stodgy, but kind of like, this is very like trans drama, like.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So
well,
that's my answer.
That's
Lots
great.
of answers.
No, well, this is good because I wanted to ask you, but I want to let the audience ask questions about your practice. You're hilarious. You're like 5:30. I'm like, oh, I'm still deep into sleep, and that you're writing again. Your book just came out, and so very jealous. Anyway, not about me. So this is the next question. This is from Erin Luo. What was the last poem you wrote for this collection, and how did you finally know it was the last one?
So the last poem I wrote was Dream of the Divided Field. I knew it was the last one because the manuscript was not done. And I needed to finish it. There was a hole and I needed to plug it, basically. Sandra was talking earlier about how this book easily could have been a book of like just fragments, or like it could leave you feeling fragmented of like, okay, here's the general idea is that there is no cohesion. I don't really work like that as a writer. I am interested in, I think, like a larger order, and I don't know how to say that without sounding like a fascist to myself. But I think for me, there always does need to, I knew that I needed to kind of move through something emotionally and narratively in this book with regard to the relationship that I wrote about, this breakup that I was writing about. And something that was very difficult for me was being as explicit as I can be around kind of the emotional abuse that happened in the relationship, and then talking about that was and continues to be scary for me, because I think part of the experience of being in close, intimate quarters with a kind of abusive dynamic that you might be replaying from your childhood. Okay, to like inside of the 8th house we go. But there's I knew that if I didn't write that poem, then the rest of the book, if you were really reading into it, you would get it, but like it wouldn't quite get to the thing that I wanted you to take away from. So it was really difficult actually to figure out how to write those things without being very explicit and also not being too sparse or too bare about it, which is actually why I removed, totally scrapped the first Dream of the Divided Field.
Wow. Okay. Okay, let me just see. Sorry. Q&A. If there's, oh wait, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, may I ask this?
Yeah.
If there, but again, please, I'm going to ask a question because we have a few minutes still, but if there's anyone in the audience, I noticed, I didn't know this until recently, that you have a sort of writing advice column called The Reading on your website. How did that come about? Is that something, I mean, only because maybe it's an Aries thing, but I don't know that. I'm a Taurus, so I'm just like, oh my God, don't ask me for advice. Don't look at my life choices. But how did that come about? The advice column or the column about writing?
You're so funny. So there's okay. The short, easy answer is that my friend Kate Welsh, who you had as a student, hi Kate, started a Substack, and I was like, oh, you can start one of these newsletters. Maybe I can do this advice podcast that I've been thinking about doing for other writers on this newsletter, like blah blah blah. Okay. And so I started the reading that way. And at first I was like, no one's going to send me questions. No one's going to follow this. I'm going to be answering my own letters. Like I'm going to be like the anonymous person. And so I asked actually a bunch of people who I knew to like send me letters, but it turned out that I didn't need to do that. The first letter I answered was from a complete stranger who I did not know. Wow. And it's been this really wonderful place for me to kind of consolidate the things that I say to people when I'm there in front of them, of like people in my MFA program, people who come to me like as students asking me for advice on like how to X, Y, or Z. And I've really enjoyed doing it. It's actually really upped my prose practice, because before that I was not really writing that much prose at all. And yeah, it's allowed me to kind of funnel the things that I like most about teaching, which is helping, or not even helping, but just like offering the things that I have learned in my survival and in my process as a writer to other people. And for me, like access has been a very important thing in that way, because of the situations that I've lived through, I like had to do a lot of Googling on my own in order to figure out how to be an adult and how to just do anything. So part of me wanted to like create a resource that other people could find, and for this very specific, very esoteric thing that we do called poetry and writing.
That's right. Oh my gosh. Well, but we wouldn't want to do anything else. I still think it's one of the best things to do ever. I guess, oh, and somebody said it's one of the most nurturing places. That's in the chat. So we are just at 8:30. And so, Jean, I know we might be, we'll like look at each other's books. Maybe we'll end with poems. Is that all right? Okay.
Sounds lovely.
All right. So I'm picking one that I like for you that I will read, or you will read.
No, you read it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, I love this one. This is the last one in the book. Once, I admit it, that we were alive at once, the same time, that we were connected to each other, and two minds move me as this life becomes a story. We were alive, we were free, choosing the hour within a moment's bright precision. There is still that hour without a future or a face. I am the hour. I am the place.
Thank you. That was such a beautiful reading. It's so cool to hear someone else read my poetry. I should do this more often. You want to hear something freaky though? I picked your poem Endings
Okay, there you go.
from The Curious Thing. Because I was like, oh, this poem reminds me of that poem in my book.
Crazy.
I was like, twinning.
Exactly.
It's astrological, everyone. Endings by Sandra Lim. The story has two endings. It has one ending and then another. Do you hear me? I do not have the heart to edit the other out.
It is, thank you. It is so strange, but kind of wonderful to hear a poem read by another poet. Thank you so much, Yanyi. Everybody should get Dream of the Divided Field. I think we can go to your website to know where you're reading next, doing other things, right?
Yeah, I'll be in NYC in 2 days for an event.
Well, it was great talking to you. And thank you, Greenlight.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sandra. I had a wonderful time chatting.
Yeah, I hope we can be in person somewhere soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Yanyi. Thank you, Sandra. That was such a wonderful conversation. I feel like I could listen back to that, and which is great because this has all been recorded and will live in perpetuity on the Greenlight Bookstore YouTube channel. Everyone, please make sure to buy a copy of Yanyi's new book and Sandra's book while you're at it. They're both on the website that I've been linking throughout the evening. Thank you both so much. Wow.
Oh gosh, yeah.
That's an amazing shot.
I know.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Make sure to check out Yanyi's website to see where he's appearing next, virtually or in person. And I bid you all farewell. Good night. Thank you so much.
Night.